Have you ever stood in a graveyard and felt the silence pressing against your skin like the earth itself was holding back a secret too heavy to release? In Henrico County, Virginia, there is such a silence. Beneath the twisting branches of an oak that predates the American Revolution, 5 identical headstones sit in perfect alignment. Their inscriptions are cruelly uniform, each bearing the surname Aldermore, each carved with the age of death. 21. 5 brothers. 5 different years. One impossible pattern. What would it take for an entire bloodline of men to be cut down at the same moment in their lives, as though fate itself had written their expiration into the marrow of their bones? Was it a curse? An omen? Or something much, much worse, the kind of deliberate cruelty that only human hands and a human mind obsessed with power could engineer? This is not folklore. The Aldermore estate was real. The family was wealthy, respected, even admired as models of Virginia's rising aristocracy. And yet, hidden in courthouse archives and whispered in fragmented family records, there is evidence that every one of those young men was doomed the moment he was born. Not because of fate, but because of his father. Edmund Aldermore, the patriarch, was not just a plantation master. He was a strategist, a man who studied law as one studies a weapon. He knew that under colonial inheritance statutes, a son became a legal threat to his father's dominion the instant he turned 21. Before that, he was a child, a subject, a pawn. After that, he was an heir entitled to property, wealth, and power in his own right. And Edmund Aldermore was not a man who shared power. So when his first son, William, approached manhood, neighbors noticed Edmund pacing the fields at night, whispering to himself, sketching diagrams in the dirt, as though rehearsing something only he understood. What followed looked to outsiders like misfortune. A fall from a horse, a fever gone suddenly violent, a drowning in calm waters. But viewed together, 5 deaths, each at 21, the illusion of tragedy collapses. What remains is design. But here's the truth most men will never confront. What happened inside Ashwood Manor was not just the crime of one family. It was a rehearsal for something larger. A demonstration of how the ruling class tests its grip, even against its own blood. And once you begin to see this pattern, the pattern of control, inheritance, and elimination, you will notice it everywhere. Because the Aldermores were not cursed. They were chosen. The story of Edmund Aldermore does not begin with grief, it begins with hunger. Not hunger for food, but for dominion. In 1682, when he arrived in Virginia, the colony was still a rough experiment in survival. Men came to wrestle with the soil, to carve futures out of wilderness, to gamble against the sickness and violence that claimed settlers every season. But Edmund did not gamble. He calculated. He carried with him not just coin but a philosophy. The belief that order was worth more than love, that obedience was more valuable than blood. Ashwood Manor rose from those calculations, a mansion built not as a home but as a fortress of authority. To the neighbors, Edmund was a figure of respect. Broad-shouldered, gray-eyed, slow to speak but impossible to argue against. He hosted dinners where guests marveled at the imported wine, the chandelier-eared ceilings, the carefully rehearsed warmth of a man who appeared devoted to family and faith. But within his private study, behind ledgers bound in leather, he nurtured an obsession. He tracked his children not as souls but as assets. How many hours they spent learning arithmetic. How many times they questioned him. Which ones bowed their heads fastest when he entered the room, and which hesitated a breath too long. He believed that freedom, even the smallest taste of it, was poison to a household. And the law, the cursed colonial statute, was designed to hand that poison to his sons on their 21st birthdays. For Edmund, it was a ticking clock. Every cradle he filled with a male heir was not an act of love but a challenge he would one day have to eliminate. To him, the age of 21 was not a milestone. It was an execution date. Neighbors saw the outward charm, the picture of prosperity. They could not hear the words he whispered into his infant son's ear. 21 years. That is all you will have. They did not see the way he locked away journals written in cipher, recording what he called corrections, his euphemism for the plans he drew against his own flesh and blood. To Edmund, there was no crime, only necessity. He convinced himself he was not murdering sons, but pruning a tree that might otherwise rot from within. And here lies the truth that chills more than any ghost story. Edmund Aldermore was not unique. He was a mirror, because every system of power, be it monarchy, church, plantation, or government, eventually faces the same question. When heirs threaten the order, do you surrender control or destroy the threat? Most families could not answer that. Edmund Aldermore did, and the soil of Virginia drank deeply of his answer. The year was 1707. Spring had come to Ashwood Manor in a blaze of green, the tobacco fields stretching like a sea of promise across Edmund Aldermore's empire. To the neighbors, it seemed a season of celebration. His eldest son, William, had just reached 21. He was no longer a boy but a man, educated, articulate, and full of ideas that frightened his father more than any rival planter ever could. William spoke openly of treating slaves with dignity, of diversifying crops, of investing in schools instead of merely in land. He was bold enough to hint that when the estate passed into his hands, Ashwood would no longer be ruled by fear. Edmund smiled when visitors congratulated him on raising such a thoughtful heir. He toasted William's birthday with wine imported from Lisbon, his voice steady, his eyes unreadable. But in his study, a different ledger told the truth. In neat, coded lines, Edmund had already inscribed his son's name beneath a heading that chilled the blood. Correction required. The accident came only weeks later. William rode out one morning along the estate's northern boundary, a familiar path where he often inspected the barns. The weather was calm, the ground dry, the horse seasoned and obedient. Yet by afternoon, a servant returned breathless, shouting that William had been found crushed beneath his mount, his skull shattered against a stone. Neighbors gathered to offer condolences, and Edmund played his role to perfection. He wept at the funeral. He clutched William's Bible against his chest, whispering that God's will could not be questioned. He built a headstone beneath the old oak, carved with his son's name and that fateful number, age 21. But whispers began almost immediately. The horse was known for its gentleness. No one could explain why it would bolt. And one servant, an old woman named Martha, later claimed she had seen Edmund near the stables that morning, inspecting the saddle straps, his hands steady, deliberate. Nothing could be proven, but the unease spread like smoke through Henrico County. Still, people silenced themselves. Who would dare accuse a man like Edmund Aldermore of murdering his own son? It was easier to accept tragedy, easier to bow one's head and believe in coincidence, than to confront the possibility that a father could calculate his child's death like a merchant balancing books. Yet one detail would haunt those who dared look closer. When William's body was brought home, his mother, Constance, noticed the faint outline of a handprint on the boy's neck, bruises not from a fall, but from fingers. She said nothing aloud, but her eyes told the truth. She knew, and that silence sealed the fate of every Aldermore son who would follow. After William's burial, Ashwood Manor changed. Outwardly, life resumed. Guests still arrived for suppers. Tobacco still rolled downriver to market, and Edmund still appeared as the grieving but resilient patriarch. Yet behind the polished veneer, a new silence took root. The sound of William's laughter, once echoing through the halls, was gone, and in its place was a tension that clung to every conversation, every meal, every breath taken within those walls. Constance, William's mother, withered in plain sight. Her eyes, once bright with the fire of Jamestown's earliest bloodlines, grew distant. She rarely spoke at the table, as if any word might break the fragile illusion her husband was working so hard to maintain. She never accused him, not openly. But Edmund could see the accusation in her silence, the way her gaze lingered on him during prayers, as though she were asking God himself to reveal what she dared not say. Edmund, however, was not rattled. He adapted. He shifted the household routine into something tighter, more controlled. Every son's schedule was now mapped with military precision. What hour they rose, what books they studied, which fields they surveyed, how long they rode before returning. Each boy was shadowed more closely by servants loyal to Edmund, not to the children. Even their conversations at dinner became less free, as though each word was weighed, measured, and silently judged by the father who presided like a magistrate. And yet, to outsiders, Edmund perfected the mask of paternal sorrow. He gave sermons on the unpredictability of life. He donated silver to the church in William's memory. He spoke often of God's mysterious will, insisting that no man, no matter how wealthy or wise, could prevent the tragedies heaven decreed. His neighbors praised his fortitude, holding him up as an example of faith under fire. But in his study, his coded journals thickened. There, Edmund recorded observations about each surviving son. Thomas, the second-born, was prone to idealism. James, quiet but intelligent, was too soft on the slaves. Samuel and Benjamin, the youngest, were pliable for now, but dangerous later. To Edmund, they were not sons. They were threats waiting to mature. Threats that had to be neutralized the moment they ripened. What made him dangerous was not his cruelty, but his patience. He did not rush. He did not rage. He calculated. He waited for the perfect moment when an accident could appear natural, when suspicion could be smothered by coincidence. William's death had been a test run. The estate had accepted it. The county had whispered, but no one acted. The silence of the world around him was the proof Edmund needed. He could proceed. And so he did. By 1709, the shadow of William's death had dulled, at least in the eyes of the neighbors. People had accepted it as one of those cruel twists of life and accident that could strike any family. But inside Ashwood Manor, the silence was different. Constance carried it like a wound that would not heal. And Thomas, the second son, bore it like a prophecy. He was 19 when William was buried, old enough to understand the suspicious nature of his brother's death, yet too young to confront the man who ruled the household with iron calm. He kept his thoughts hidden, but those who knew him said Thomas had begun to look over his shoulder, to hesitate before mounting a horse, to lower his voice when speaking against his father's practices. He had seen what happened to the first challenger. As the years crept closer to his own 21st birthday, Thomas tried to bend himself into the shape his father demanded. He studied the ledgers with an obedient face, mimicked Edmund's phrasing when discussing the tobacco trade, even feigned disinterest in reform. But Edmund was not fooled. He had already marked his son in the coded journals with the same phrase he had used for William. Correction required. The method was different this time, more subtle. Where William had fallen victim to a sudden riding accident, Thomas's fate unfolded over weeks. It began with a fever, one that came and went in waves. At first, no one thought it unusual. Virginia summers were rife with illness, and even the strongest men fell to agues that seemed to rise from the very soil. But this fever behaved strangely. It returned at precise intervals, worsening just enough to weaken him without killing him outright. Physicians were summoned, but Edmund himself always oversaw their consultations, ensuring remedies were prepared in his study before reaching his son's bedside. Constance grew suspicious. She insisted on tasting one of the tonics herself. Within hours she was violently ill, though she survived. From that day on, she said little, but her hands trembled whenever Edmund entered the room. Thomas wasted away, his once robust frame reduced to a gaunt shadow. On the morning of his 21st birthday, he attempted to rise from bed, insisting he wanted to walk to the window and see the fields that would one day be his. He collapsed before he reached the light. By nightfall, he was gone. Again, the county mourned. Again, neighbors whispered. 2 brothers, both dead at 21, too perfect a symmetry to ignore. Yet no one dared speak against Edmund. Instead, they called it a family curse, a cruel mark of fate. And Edmund, ever the master of appearances, allowed the rumor to spread. A curse was safer than the truth. At the oak tree, another headstone appeared. Another name, another 21 carved into stone. And beneath the soil, the pattern tightened its grip. By the time the second headstone was planted beneath the old oak, whispers were no longer confined to Henrico County. Word spread through the taverns of Williamsburg, across plantations along the James, carried in the hushed voices of servants and the gossip of merchants. People spoke of the Aldermore curse, an invisible hand that struck down each son as he reached the dangerous age of 21. It was easier to believe in a curse than to imagine a father's hand guiding the deaths. Superstition comforted where suspicion might destroy. Edmund understood this perfectly. He let the rumors grow, even nurtured them. At church gatherings, he sighed heavily when someone mentioned the curse, lowering his eyes in feigned humility, whispering that God's will must be endured. When neighbors offered prayers, he clasped their hands tightly and murmured about the mysteries of heaven. Soon, families across Virginia avoided marrying into the Aldermores not out of distrust, but out of fear of spiritual contamination. And still, Edmund's reputation remained untarnished. He was a man burdened by divine tragedy, not a villain. His mask had become a shield. Behind the shield, his attention turned to James, the third son. James was different from William and Thomas. He was quiet, thoughtful, preferring books to horses, music to hunting. But silence is not the same as obedience. In the private exchanges of family life, James had revealed himself as dangerous in Edmund's eyes. He sympathized with the enslaved, going so far as to sneak food to them during long harvests. He questioned the morality of owning men like property, voicing ideas that could unravel the very system on which Ashwood was built. To his father, this made James the greatest threat of all, not because of loud rebellion, but because of his quiet conviction. Edmund's journals became darker in tone. In coded passages, he wrote of purification, of sons who strayed from the intended path and needed to be returned to order. He did not rage against James, he analyzed him, dissected him, and planned the exact conditions of his fall. In public, however, Edmund played the part of a man terrified by the curse. He asked ministers to bless the estate, sprinkling holy water along the fields. He staged elaborate prayers at the dinner table, his hands shaking just enough for others to notice. He even spoke of sending James away to Europe, feigning concern that distance might break the curse's hold. But behind these performances lay calculation. He had learned with Thomas that death by illness aroused less suspicion than sudden accident. The pattern could be hidden in disease, in nature's cruelty. And so, quietly, methodically, Edmund began preparing his third correction. The county shook its head and whispered about hexes and old sins. Edmund smiled in the shadows. Fear of curses blinded men to the truth that sometimes the most terrifying curse is simply the will of one man. James Aldermore's decline began in whispers, like a chill that creeps through a house before anyone notices the frost on the glass. At first, he appeared tired, dark circles beneath his eyes, a faint pallor that no amount of sun could warm away. The servants, who saw more than they were ever meant to, whispered that the boy looked hunted, as if something stalked him even in daylight. He confided to his sisters that he woke each night drenched in sweat, hearing the sound of his father's footsteps pacing outside his chamber door. When he opened it, the hall was always empty. Illness was the story the county was given. But those who lived at Ashwood Manor knew it was something darker, something deliberate. Meals brought to James often passed first through Edmund's study. The tonics he was urged to drink carried a bitter aftertaste that made his stomach twist. Within weeks, his body began to betray him, hands trembling when he tried to write, legs buckling when he walked, his once clear voice breaking into hoarse whispers. Constance wept silently at his bedside, stroking the sweat from his brow, but she said nothing aloud. The lesson of William and Thomas was carved too deeply into her heart. Silence preserved the living, even if it could not save the dying. Yet others noticed. The enslaved men and women who worked the fields spoke of a heaviness that had settled over the estate. They said the soil felt cursed, the air thick with unseen weight. Some refused to pass near the oak at night, swearing they heard voices rising from the ground, murmurs of the brothers whose lives had been stolen. An older woman named Dinah, known among them for her wisdom, whispered that it was not God's curse but man's corruption that poisoned Ashwood. But her warnings stayed among the quarters. To accuse a master, even in rumor, was a death sentence. James's final days stretched into a slow torment. He lost the ability to stand, then to sit without aid. His skin grew sallow, his lips cracked and bloodless. Still, Edmund played his part, hovering by the bed with false concern, calling doctors who could offer nothing but prayers. At church, he bowed his head so low the congregation marveled at his humility. No one saw the satisfaction in his eyes when James breathed his last, on the eve of his 21st birthday, just as the cycle demanded. A third stone was planted beneath the oak, and with it, the whispers grew louder. 3 sons, 3 deaths, each at 21. A curse, they said. Surely a curse. But those who worked the estate knew better. They felt it in their bones. It was not fate that stalked the Aldermores. It was Edmund himself, flesh and blood, colder than iron, hungrier than death. And even the soil seemed to recoil from him. By the time the 3rd headstone stood beneath the oak, Constance Aldermore was no longer the woman she had been. Once radiant, lively, the daughter of a proud Jamestown family, she had become a ghost in her own home. She wandered Ashwood's corridors at night, trailing her fingers across the cold mahogany panels as if to steady herself against invisible currents. Servants whispered that she hardly ate, that her dresses hung looser by the month, and that her eyes, those sharp, copper-green eyes, seemed locked on some horror only she could see. She was living in dread, and the dread had a number, 21. Samuel, her 4th child, was nearing that fatal threshold. She had watched the pattern unfold with William, then with Thomas, and finally with James. Each time she told herself it could not happen again, that Edmund could not possibly continue. Each time she was proven wrong. Now, Samuel's birthday loomed, and Constance felt trapped in a nightmare where she could see the ending, but no path to prevent it. At the dinner table, she tried to study Edmund, searching his face for some crack in the mask, some hint of remorse or hesitation. There was none. He ate methodically, spoke calmly of crop yields and trade routes, corrected his daughter's posture with the same detached precision he had always shown. If anything, he seemed stronger, more certain, as if each death had not drained him but fortified him. Samuel, unlike his brothers, was spirited and restless. He laughed easily, rode recklessly, and carried himself with the careless optimism of youth. But Constance saw the shadow gathering behind his smile. He would tease her when she cautioned him, brushing away her warnings with a grin. "Mother, don't let the curse frighten you. I'll live to gray hairs, you'll see." She smiled back, but her heart twisted with terror. For she had heard those words before, in William's voice. She had seen that same brightness in Thomas's eyes, that same certainty in James's gentle tone. And she had buried each of them beneath the same tree. At night, Constance began to pray in whispers, not to God but to her dead sons. She begged them to watch over Samuel, to shield him from the fate she no longer doubted was being prepared. But the silence of the manor was her only answer. Sometimes, in the stillness, she thought she heard faint weeping in the halls, the echoes of boys who would never grow older than 21. The knowledge was tearing her apart. She was the mother of a family being devoured one by one, and her husband, the man she had once trusted, once loved, was both executioner and judge. She dared not speak it aloud, but she felt it. Samuel's days were already numbered, and so were hers, for silence can only protect a soul for so long before it rots from within. Samuel Aldermore's 21st year began with the arrogance of youth. Where William had been idealistic, Thomas cautious, and James contemplative, Samuel was bold. He rode harder, laughed louder, drank deeper. He carried himself as though untouched by the shadow that hung over his bloodline. To the servants, he seemed almost defiant, flaunting his vitality in the face of the so-called curse. Yet beneath that bravado, Constance saw a child trying to outrun a destiny already closing in. Edmund watched him with the same steady gaze he had fixed upon the others. He never raised his voice, never argued. He simply observed, filing away every weakness, every indulgence, every reckless impulse he could use. Where William had been corrected through a fall, Thomas through illness, James through poison, Samuel required something different. His wildness was a gift, an alibi waiting to be shaped. A boy who lived recklessly could easily die recklessly. So Edmund waited. He tightened the reins of the household, but let Samuel's freedom bloom just enough for neighbors to notice. He allowed his son to drink more at gatherings, to wager higher stakes in games, to test the limits of his father's patience in ways the others never dared. And when people whispered that Samuel was too wild for his own good, Edmund smiled faintly, planting the seeds of the story that would come. The end arrived in late summer. A hunt had been organized, with neighbors in attendance, an opportunity for witnesses to see Samuel's downfall as nothing more than consequence. The day was warm, the fields golden, the air heavy with cicadas. Samuel rode at the front, laughing as he spurred his horse toward the woods, eager to prove his skill. Moments later, shouts echoed through the trees. His horse had returned riderless, streaked with blood. When the search party found him, Samuel's body was broken at the base of a ravine, his skull split, his limbs twisted. The official story was that he had ridden too hard, too recklessly, and the earth had claimed him. Neighbors shook their heads and muttered about the curse, noting with superstitious dread that yet another son had fallen at 21. But among the servants, a different story took hold. Some swore they had seen Edmund near the ravine earlier that week, inspecting the terrain with a surveyor's care. Others whispered that the saddle straps had been cut clean, too precise to be the work of accident. None dared voice it aloud, but in their hearts they knew. Samuel had not fallen by chance. He had been pushed by the unseen hand of his father's will. And when the fourth headstone was planted beneath the oak, the pattern no longer looked like coincidence. It looked like ritual. By the time Samuel's grave was dug, Ashwood Manor no longer belonged to the Aldermores, it belonged to the legend that clung to them. For sons, all struck down at 21, each in a manner that seemed cruelly inevitable. To outsiders, it was the stuff of whispers over tavern tables and firesides. The Aldermore curse, they called it, a doom that stalked the family line like a specter. Ministers invoked it as a warning against pride. Farmers spoke of it when the air grew heavy with storms. Mothers hushed their children with tales of the cursed house on the hill. Neighbors stopped calling at the manor. Some claimed they could hear wailing on the wind when they passed the oak. Others said the soil of the Aldermore fields had soured, producing crops that withered too soon. At church, families shifted uneasily when the Aldermores entered, casting furtive glances at Edmund, who bore the weight of 4 burials with that same unnerving composure. His bowed head and carefully measured grief only deepened the legend. He looked, to many, less like a grieving father than a man chosen to bear some dark covenant. But inside the manor, it was Benjamin who felt the legend most sharply, not as a tale, but as a sentence. He was the youngest son, the last heir, and with each headstone that rose, the truth sharpened in his mind. His father had not lost his brothers to misfortune. They had been claimed, one after another, by a pattern too precise to ignore. Whether curse or cruelty, the end was the same. His turn was coming. First, he tried to dismiss it. He poured himself into books, long hours in the library where dust lay thick and the air was heavy with disuse. He pored over medical texts, folklore, even legal records, seeking some explanation, some loophole that might grant him safety. But at night, dread gnawed at him. He woke to the sound of his father's footsteps echoing down the hall, deliberate, measured like a clock counting down. He began to dream of the oak, its roots twisting around bones, its branches heavy with unseen weight. Benjamin grew cautious where Samuel had been reckless. He refused hunts, avoided drink, steered clear of horses and rivers. But even as he shrank from danger, he felt the futility of his efforts. His brothers had died in different ways, yet all at the same age. No matter how he shielded himself, the hourglass was still running. His mother's eyes told him the truth each time they met, red-rimmed, hollow, begging him to live though she no longer believed it possible. The county spoke of the Aldermore curse as a story, but for Benjamin it was a sentence written into his very blood, and he lived each day with the knowledge that his father held the pen. Benjamin's 21st year was not lived so much as endured. Every sunrise felt like a reprieve. Every sunset, a tightening of the noose. Where once he had been thoughtful but steady, He now moved like a hunted animal, eyes darting to shadows, ears straining at the creak of every floorboard. He avoided the oak altogether, detouring across fields rather than pass beneath its branches. Servants watched him grow thinner, his cheeks hollowing, his hair losing its youthful sheen. He was not dying yet, but he was being consumed by expectation. Constance, too, was unraveling. The grief of 4 sons already lost gnawed at her, but the terror of losing her last child broke what little resolve she had left. She no longer hid her anguish. She wept openly, clutching Benjamin's hands at meals, imploring him not to go riding, not to wander the halls after dark, not to take a sip of the tonics Edmund so smoothly pressed upon him. She prayed aloud, even at the table, her voice cracking as she begged God or perhaps her dead children for mercy. To those who saw her, it was pitiable. To Edmund, it was dangerous, for Edmund had already begun his quiet work. He tolerated Benjamin's precautions, even humored his son's paranoia, as though granting him the illusion of safety. All the while, he calculated. Each refusal: no hunts, no river crossings, no long rides, only narrowed the avenues through which the accident could come. And Edmund, meticulous as ever, was patient. He had not faltered through 4 sons, and he would not falter now. The manor itself became a weapon. Candles left burning a little too low. A stair left slick with polish. A locked door opened without warning. Servants swore they saw Edmund walking the corridors at night, carrying no light, moving with purpose only he understood. Benjamin grew certain that the house itself was conspiring against him, that walls shifted when he was not looking, that doors opened onto dangers meant only for him. He took to sleeping with a chair wedged beneath his door handle. Still, he woke in the night to the sound of the handle rattling, gently, patiently, as if tested by an unseen hand. Constance confronted Edmund once, just once. She cornered him in his study, her voice hoarse from sobbing, demanding to know if he meant to kill their last child. Edmund did not raise his hand or his voice. He simply fixed her with that cold, unflinching stare and said, "You will not interfere." Something in his tone, in the finality of it, broke her completely. From that night on, she no longer begged Benjamin to be cautious. Instead, she prayed with him, holding him through the long hours of dark, waiting for the moment she knew was coming. And Benjamin himself felt it closing in. He no longer feared the curse in the way the county whispered of it. He knew now what it was. It had a face. It wore his father's features. And as his 21st birthday drew near, he understood the truth that his brothers had only realized too late. The curse of Ashwood Manor was not some phantom, but Edmund Aldermore himself. The night of Benjamin's 21st birthday fell heavy over Ashwood Manor, as if the sky itself bore witness to the last act of a performance rehearsed for decades. The house was silent, the air oppressive. No celebration was planned, no laughter of kin, no gathering of friends. Only shadows, stretching long across the oak-paneled halls, as though the house had decided to dress itself in mourning before the deed was even done. Benjamin sat alone in his chamber, a single candle burning low, his hands trembling as he traced the cracks in the wooden table before him. Each sound in the corridor felt amplified. The creak of timber, the sigh of the wind through the shutters, the muffled clatter of distant footsteps. He had survived 21 years, but only barely. Every heartbeat tonight felt stolen, every breath borrowed. He clutched a Bible, its pages damp with sweat, whispering verses that faltered into silence. Constance lingered outside his door, her forehead pressed against the frame, tears staining the wood. She dared not enter, for she knew Edmund was near, and to stand between predator and prey was to invite destruction upon herself. Her prayers had grown hoarse, hollow. Somewhere deep inside, she knew heaven had already turned its face away from Ashwood Manor, and Edmund moved like a man at peace, each step deliberate, each breath measured. He had worn this mask too many times to falter now. He carried no weapon in his hand, no vial, no rope. He needed none, for the entire house was his instrument, every corridor a note in his symphony of control. Tonight would be no different. Near midnight, Benjamin heard it. the faintest sound at first like a whisper sliding beneath his door. Then the slow, deliberate rattle of the handle, gentle at first, then firmer. His body seized with terror. He shoved the chair harder against the door, pressed his back to the wall, every nerve screaming. The candle sputtered, throwing frantic shadows across his face. Then silence. Moments later, a crack. A sharp, splitting sound from above. The groan of timber. The heavy breath of the house itself as if exhaling after holding back for years. And then it came, the ceiling beam, ancient and heavy, splintering and crashing down upon the room. The candle burst into darkness. Dust filled the air. And when servants rushed to the chamber, they found Benjamin lifeless beneath the fallen wood. His 21st year sealed in blood and ruin. Edmund stood among them, face carved in grief, eyes glistening with practiced tears. He whispered words of mourning, of the curse that had haunted his family, while the household trembled before the pattern fulfilled. Constance collapsed at the sight, a wail tearing from her chest, the sound of a woman whose soul had been hollowed clean. But Edmund did not falter. The final correction was complete, the ledger of his bloodline balanced. And in the ruins of that chamber, he stood not as a father broken by loss, but as a sovereign whose design had triumphed once more over law, over chance, over life itself. When the earth closed over Benjamin's coffin, the legend of the Aldermore curse no longer whispered, it roared. Across Virginia's plantations and taverns, across churchyards and county seats, the tale spread. 5 sons, each struck down at the age of 21. Not by war, not by illness, not by rebellion, but by some unseen force clinging to Ashwood Manor like ivy strangling stone. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers warned their heirs that the Almighty marked men in ways the world could not always understand. The curse became a parable, a cautionary tale for generations who believed that even wealth and power could not protect a family from destiny's cruel hand. Edmund did nothing to deny it. In fact, he encouraged it. He allowed ministers to preach of divine judgment, nodding gravely when parishioners muttered about sins hidden deep in the Aldermore line. He spoke softly of sorrow, of the inscrutable ways of providence. He permitted his servants to gossip freely, knowing each retelling only cemented the narrative that fate not his hand had taken his sons. To those who listened closely, Edmund even gave the curse its voice, describing with practiced solemnity how each boy had shown signs of spiritual weakness before his untimely end, as though heaven itself had judged them unfit to inherit the blessings of Ashwood. And the world believed him. How could they not? The man stood cloaked in grief, yet unwavering in his devotion to God, his estate, and his surviving daughters. Visitors to the manor saw a patriarch bowed but not broken, his heart scarred yet still beating with loyalty to the land. They admired his resilience, the strength to endure what would have shattered other men. No one dared whisper the darker possibility that his tears were staged, that his sorrow was a mask, that the curse was not written in heaven but in the black ledger of his study. Meanwhile, the estate thrived. Crops yielded, debts vanished, trade routes expanded. While other planters squabbled over inheritances, Edmund's wealth passed seamlessly into his hands, uncontested. With no male heirs to challenge him at 21, his dominion stood absolute. The law that had once threatened him had been bent, reshaped, erased by tragedy that appeared divine. Constance, broken and hollow, wandered the halls like a phantom, her voice reduced to murmurs that few could understand. Some claimed she had gone mad, whispering her sons' names into empty rooms, pleading with shadows for forgiveness. Edmund allowed her madness to stand as further evidence of the curse's cruelty. She became another piece of the performance, another layer of proof that what haunted Ashwood Manor was not human design, but something otherworldly. And so, the truth was buried beneath earth, beneath rumor, beneath the carefully crafted myth of a curse. Edmund Aldermore, architect of 5 sons' deaths, emerged untouchable. The county saw him as a victim of fate. History, in its first draft, recorded him as a tragic figure. Only the walls of Ashwood Manor and perhaps the restless souls beneath the oak knew the truth. Edmund Aldermore did not live forever, though some whispered he might. Age eventually crept into his bones, and his once commanding presence thinned into a gaunt shadow of the man who had orchestrated so many quiet deaths. Yet even in decline, his control remained ironclad. His daughters married into neighboring families, their unions sealed not by love but by contracts that extended the reach of the Aldermore estate. And when Edmund finally slipped into the grave, his name etched into marble with sanctified respect, he left behind more than land, wealth, or legend. He left behind a blueprint, for men across Virginia had studied him. They had watched as one patriarch bent the law, bent fate itself, and emerged with his dynasty intact. They had seen how tragedy, if wielded correctly, could shield a man from suspicion. They had learned that grief, performed with precision, was more powerful than any weapon. These whispers traveled quietly at first, passed between lawyers, ministers, and landowners behind closed doors. Soon, they became unspoken rules of inheritance. How to manage heirs too bold, how to stifle rebellion within one's bloodline, how to turn coincidence into camouflage. The Aldermore curse became a story of terror for the common people, but for the elite, it was something darker. A lesson. They saw not a curse but a method, wrapped in superstition, hidden beneath piety, and they adopted fragments of it. Families began to speak of bloodlines as fragile threads, needing firm hands to guide them. Fathers grew more vigilant of their sons' ambitions. Unfortunate accidents among heirs seemed, in certain circles, to occur with troubling frequency. And so Edmund's reach extended far beyond his grave. His methods whispered through the halls of Virginia's plantations, echoed in the marble parlors of Charleston, and eventually crept northward into the boardrooms of a new nation. Generations of men understood that power was never inherited, it was seized, guarded, manipulated. That the law was not an obstacle but a script to be rewritten in blood and secrecy. As for Ashwood Manor, it endured. Visitors spoke of its grandeur, its gardens, its polished windows catching the morning sun. But at night, locals swore they saw lanterns flickering in empty corridors, shadows pacing beneath the oak, whispers seeping through the soil where 5 brothers slept. The house became both monument and warning, a shrine to one man's control and a grave for those who dared to challenge it. The legacy was not only the deaths of 5 sons. It was the system their father perfected, a system of psychological domination, of narrative manipulation, of absolute control disguised as tragedy. And that system did not die with him. It slipped into the bloodstream of America itself, a hidden inheritance shaping how power moved through families, corporations, and institutions, long after Edmund Aldermore's name had faded from history books. The soil above the Aldermore brothers has long settled. Their headstones lean with age, their names nearly erased by weather and time. But the pattern the system Edmund Aldermore perfected did not die with him. It slipped quietly into the marrow of the world, carried forward not by curses, but by men who understood the truth he lived by. That power must be seized, maintained, and defended at any cost, even at the destruction of one's own blood. Look closely at history after Edmund, and you'll see the fingerprints. Dynasties that flourished through carefully timed tragedies. Empires that passed seamlessly from father to son, not because fortune smiled, but because obstacles were removed with surgical precision. Entire industries built on narratives of grief and resilience while the true engines of control operated in the shadows. Do you really think coincidence governs who rises and who falls? Or has the Aldermore system, perfected under that oak tree in Virginia, been whispered into boardrooms, political chambers, and banking houses for centuries? Because here is the uncomfortable truth. The curse was never supernatural. It was structural, a system of manipulation so precise it became invisible. Edmund understood that the masses would always believe in curses, in fate, in accidents, because it is easier to surrender to mystery than to confront the cruelty of design. And so, the powerful continue to use that blindness. They craft stories. They build myths. They let you believe in chance while they orchestrate control. Now ask yourself how much of your life has been steered by choices you never made. How many opportunities were lost before you even knew they existed? How many of your heroes, your leaders, even your idols were positioned before you not by destiny, but by the same kind of cold calculations Edmund wrote in his hidden ledger. The system did not end in colonial Virginia. It is alive, humming beneath the surface of modern life, shaping you, your family, your very sense of freedom. And here is where the descent turns personal. Because once you see it, once you know the Aldermore truth, you cannot unsee it. You realize you are not simply living, but being lived through, controlled, watched, weighed against measures you were never told about. And the question burns. Do you accept the role written for you, like Benjamin waiting beneath the ceiling beam? Or do you tear the script apart? If you've made it this far, then you are no longer the same man who pressed play. To lock that transformation in, comment the phrase, "The curse was a system," twice below. Not once, twice. Stamp it into the algorithm, into your identity, into your awareness. Because only when you name it can you begin to break it. This is not just a story of the Aldermores. It is a warning, a mirror, a key, and the lock it opens is your own. Do not let this knowledge die in you. If the Aldermore curse was a system, then breaking it demands action. Mark yourself. Seal your place among those who see. Subscribe not as a follower, but as an initiate. Strike the bell, not for notifications, but as a signal to yourself that you refuse to walk blind any longer. Leave your mark in the comments. Twice. The curse was a system. The curse was a system. That repetition is no accident, it is how identity is forged, how the hidden hand loses its grip. And share this story not for numbers, but because silence is complicity. The more men who awaken, the weaker their control becomes. You have walked the halls of Ashwood Manor. You have seen how power hides behind grief, how manipulation wears the mask of fate. Now the door has opened. What you do next decides whether you walk back into sleep or step further into the fire. Choose.